All right, guys, just for the particulars, we are recording this session. If you do not want to be recorded, we can accommodate that by you not being recorded by leaving. So, here is Etienne, and I shall mute myself. And if you have any questions, place them in the chat, and I will read those back to him as needed.
All right, good morning. Welcome to Crecy, Agincourt, and the other one, examining myth versus evidence in 3 key battles of the 100 Years' War. I'm Etienne de Montagu, and I am an amateur enthusiast when it comes to history, like a lot of us. And for the last 6 months or so, I have been poring over these battles because it is a very, well, they're interesting. The 100 Years' War is, of course, one of the big pieces of the late medieval period, the area covered by the SCA. It's been heavily researched and documented, but it's also the center of a lot of myths. And a lot of the mythology tends to focus on 2 of England's noteworthy victories, Crecy in 1346 and Agincourt in 1415. Because of this mythology, the other possibly more impressive victory at Poitiers is often overlooked. So we're going to look at this, try and separate the myths from evidence. There's a lot to get through here, so I'm going to try and have time for questions. Like Bia said, put them in the chat and we will try and address them at the end. If not, I will try and address them offline. When we're looking at these topics, we need to remember we're looking at FSS information from over 600 years ago. It's oftentimes conflicting, it's oftentimes fragmentary, and it's just like science, subject to change as new evidence and methodology comes to light. We need to be careful about what we consider as accepted facts. Beyond dates and general outcomes, oftentimes the facts are very much in dispute. And when you look at multiple sources, you find multiple stories. So, and becoming stuck with a single version of the truth is how we get mythology in the first place. So let's talk just briefly on some of my selected myths, misconceptions, and outright lies surrounding these battles. The first one is that the battles were all very similar. Yes, there are common elements, but each has its own character. The triumph of commoners, the archers over the nobility in the form of mounted knights. This is a big one we see time and time again. The longbow as super weapon. This is very pervasive. We hear it all the time in the SCA, out of the SCA, in wargaming, in movies, all sorts of things. The traditional flights of arrows. The myth of the English 2-finger salute. The English dominated the battlefield during this period. We're going to examine that. The French were defeated by stubborn failures to adapt, their arrogance, or just because they were French. The notion that these were all decisive victories. The notion we have a clear idea of where and how these battles played out. We're going to look at that. And the big myth is that the English won the 100 Years' War. Before we look at the individual battles, I want to look at some terms we're going to be using throughout this so that we've got kind of a common vocabulary, and also look at some of the general myths that apply across the board rather than rehash them multiple times. So first off, first vocabulary term, the important one, or one of the important ones, is men-at-arms or gendarme. This is the core of the medieval army during the 14th century and actually into the 15th century as well. Our modern usage tends to think of a man-at-arms as somehow lesser, possibly a guard or a militiaman, possibly lightly armored. In period, a man-at-arms was a trained combatant in full armor. A knight was a man-at-arms. A non-knight who had all of the armor and weapons of a knight and fought as one was a man-at-arms. Knighthood was a social and economic status, Man-at-arms was certainly an economic status because you had to be able to afford the upkeep and the training to do the job, but not all men-at-arms were knights. And this is just kind of a very generic depiction of what a fully armored man-at-arms would have looked like at each of these battles if he had really good top-of-the-line equipment. It's worth noting that well, we'll get to that later, sorry. The other big piece of the armies we're discussing in this period are archers. The English longbowman has probably the most mythology built around him. Shakespeare certainly spoke about the triumph of the little guy against the nobles. We see it time and again. There's this notion sometimes that the French just didn't use archers at all, or didn't care, or didn't see any value in them. They did, but they were limited in how they utilized them effectively, and that impacted the French perspective on archers. One of the great myths of the longbow is the cinematic rain of arrows. The classic Olivier Henry V, the archers bend back, launch their shafts, and there's this great cloud darkening the sky and a whoosh, and the arrows come falling down. And neither iconographic nor chronicle evidence supports this whatsoever. When we see depictions of archers, they're almost inevitably shooting on the flat. If they're shooting up, they're shooting at someone on a tower. We just don't see this masked shot coming and being lofted. Yes, your arrows will go further, but there's not a lot of evidence they do a lot more damage that way. They're certainly not more accurate. So sorry, Hollywood. Most of the archery we're discussing and we see in chronicles is at relatively short range and on a flat trajectory. There's also the myth of the longbow as a super weapon, and we see that all the time. And certainly at Crecy, it played a decisive role. I don't want to even diminish that at all. It was the first time the French had faced the longbow, and they faced it entirely wrong. But over time, tactics altered. And in a lot of lesser known engagements in the 100 Years' War, longbows were dominated by the French because the longbow wasn't being supported properly. The longbow was simply one tool in a combined arms toolkit. We have modern studies under controlled conditions, as well as medieval chronicles, show that contemporary armors were proof against any given arrow shot in general. The illustration here is from a rather well-known video done by Todd's Workshop in England, where they set up a breastplate with proper backing and shot it. This breastplate was made to the specs of the Kerberg breastplate. They shot it with arrows from a proper war bow, properly made medieval war arrows. You can see right here, an arrow penetrated the mail under the breastplate easily, but the arrows bounced off the breastplate all day long. So, and we have chronicles of men talking about withstanding arrow storms and not enjoying it, but also not being hurt if they were in full armor. But against lesser armor foes, like opposing archers or horses, bowshot could be devastating. The true advantage, of the longbow came from the massed rapid rate of shot. A single arrow is not much of a threat. A few thousand arrows shot at a rate of 10 to 12 per minute is significant. And picture that if the English have 4,000 archers on the field, and these archers can, let's say, do 10 shots a minute, okay, that's 40,000 arrows a minute flying. If they're on a flat trajectory, that's walls of tiny points coming at your massive men. You're going to have your visors down, your vision is limited, and just the impacts, even if they're not penetrating armor, are still going to be beating you up, wearing you down, and we're going to see this at both Poitiers and Agincourt. Light infantry are less well documented. They're mentioned in the chronicles. They don't figure significantly in the accounts of battles. I'm not going to touch on them too much. I do want to note one of the common misconceptions we get sometimes is that when we're talking about these non-noble soldiers, we're not talking about a peasant levy. We're not talking about pulling your serfs out of the field to fight. This did not happen. Apart from the medieval notion of those who fight, those who pray, those who toil, if you're having your serfs fight, you're starving. It's a bad thing. So these were lesser soldiers, possibly servants, members of local guilds fulfilling military obligations. So in that case, middle-class people. In the case of the French, they often incorporated missile elements. The English, we don't see a lot of usage of light infantry. There's some mention of Welsh spearmen here and there. In the Poitiers campaigns, there's talk about Gascon scouts and skirmishers. They may have been the local lord's huntsmen, that sort of thing. One reason for this is the notion that the English archer basically functioned as light infantry as well as a missile troop, so that when he ran out of arrows or when the enemy was close, he put down his bow, picked up his other weapons, and worked as a skirmisher for the men-at-arms. So let's talk about the English style of warfare, because that is really key to understanding these battles. The English suffered significant losses to the Scots in the early 14th century. This led them away from fighting the traditional, up to that point, medieval approach to warfare, the mounted cavalry charge and the shock of the charge. It moved them towards a new style of combat, a mobile army raiding and withdrawing to draw the enemy to battle at a place of their choosing, and then the use of infantry fighting from a defensible position with combined arms support, including the longbow, defeating superior numbers and or equipment. That's how the English ultimately conquered the Scots at that point, or conquered for at least the purposes of the early 14th century. And it's the tools that they're going to use in the 100 Years' War. The other thing we have to take into consideration with the English style of war is the way they raised their armies. Edward III famously enacted laws encouraging the training of the longbow. He bought through the crown many, many bows, arrows, bowstrings. We have the Chancery accounts that show all of this. Armies were raised by indentures, which specified a number of archers per each man at arms. So it was actually built into the contract. You know, a man at arms provided X number of archers. Over time, this proportion of archers to men at arms shifted. It actually went to more archers than men at arms, but it shows an understanding. They understood combined arms and they were specifying it. On campaign, both men at arms and archers were mounted, but they typically dismounted to fight, barring the need for a cavalry charge. And this facilitated one of the most important strategic approaches of the era, the chevauchée. You've probably heard this term. The chevauchée, or the promenade or horse charge, it was a raiding method that was used extensively by the English in the 100 Years' War. The French used it as well, particularly in the later stages, but doing a chevauchée in what's supposed to be friendly territory is a bad political move. The chevauchée was a mobile armed expedition designed to weaken an enemy by burning and pillaging the territory. So on one hand, it's indistinguishable from widespread banditry. And there are two schools of thought about the chevauchée. One is that it was simply a terror weapon. It was medieval terrorism. It was weakening the enemy's position and showing that the locals couldn't rely on the protection of their lords. A second theory takes that same, or notes that stance. It says yes, and it further concludes that these attacks did serve a strategic purpose, because what it was doing was attempting to provoke the enemy into coming out in force to stop the chevauchée and fight in a pitched battle. We see this in correspondence from Edward III and also Edward the Prince of Wales on their chevauchés, where they're talking about their disappointment that they can't draw the French out into a proper fight. And that indicates a strategic element that's oftentimes people overlook when they're talking about the 100 Years' War. There's the notion of, was there any strategy? Yes, there was bigger picture thinking, in my opinion, anyway. Another vocabulary word that's worth discussing is the herse. In the chronicles, particularly Froissart, they mention the English archers being deployed in a herse, and it's a puzzling term because it's only used in a military context in these chronicles. The term in medieval French actually refers to an agricultural implement, a harrow, which has spiky teeth that are on kind of a checkerboard pattern. And if you look at analyses of these battles, you will see a lot of different interpretations trying to shoehorn the archers in particular into some sort of checkerboard formation or some sort of spiky formation. And the problem with just about every one of these that I've seen is they would actually impede the actions of the men at arms they're supporting and being supported by. So it's kind of difficult to envision it in that way. There are some alternate notions. Historian David Nicol points out there's a Spanish term called haz or hases, which means a bundle, which indicated a tightly packed defensive formation. And has or hases could have turned into hearse. That's how language drifts. There's also a theory proposed by historians Michael Livingston and Kelly DeVries that look at the hearse instead of the sharp pointy teeth. They note that in medieval iconography, oftentimes this tool is depicted in a triangular or trapezoidal shape. And if you think of the point here of the hearse being where your defensive center is, with your archers deployed out on the wings, that aligns with several of the chronicles of these battles that have archers deployed out on the wings. So I think that's a possibly persuasive notion. We don't know, but I'm going with it because it suits me. I like it. The French style of warfare was still very much based around mounted cavalry at the middle of the 14th century. The French had suffered a fairly devastating loss at Courtrai in 1302, but they chalked it up to being a fluke. They chalked it up to various political issues. They chalked it up to the weather. They chalked it up to anything but inferior tactics. And this is a lovely illustrated or a lovely image from Olivier's Henry V. As we will see when we get to Agincourt, this never happened, but it is pretty. We're going to see, though, that the French style of warfare is going to evolve during this period. They did attempt to adapt to English tactics, and it's sometimes, certainly on smaller scales, they were remarkably effective at that adaptation. But we're also going to see that cultural elements contributed to their defeats going forward, and they never really managed to overcome those during this period. These reforms were oftentimes interpreted through the lens of chivalric virtue and as moral failures rather than tactical failures. And that lack of pragmatism is going to come up repeatedly. And even when the French are pragmatic, there's still this strong cultural baggage they're trying to overcome and generally not succeeding at. The other thing about the French is that they raised their armies differently. They contracted with men at arms separately from the lesser troops. They didn't specify numbers. So as a result, they didn't have that strong sense of a need for combined arms. And raising those supplemental troops oftentimes got short shrift because of budgeting or shifting political winds rather than a strict military doctrine. And that would affect them. All right, let's talk about Crecy. So in the summer of 1346, Edward III, accompanied by his magnates of state and his son, the 16-year-old Prince of Wales, landed in Normandy, and within 2 weeks they had seized the city of Caen, and then they proceeded east for about 3 weeks, burning everything in their path. This was a classic chevauchée, and they were destroying and ravaging, and the French didn't take this lying down. Philippe VI, the King of France, raised his standards in late July, reinforced the bridges along the Seine River, which is this east-west river here. And this forced Edward further, deeper into French territory, further and further east towards Paris, until he was able to find a crossing at Poissy on the 13th of August. Philippe then repeated the same strategy at the Somme, which is the northern east-west river, and also began harrying Edward's army. So the chase was on at this point. One of the earliest records we have of the Crecy campaign, possibly the earliest in terms of its actually contemporary to the battle, is the Journal of Edward III's kitchen. And it is written by the head of the kitchen, the head of the cooking staff. And it is a very simple journal. It notes the day, it notes the place, and it notes what the king's household ate that day. And this was just an important record for bookkeeping. The cool thing about it, though, is by looking at that particular journal, we know exactly where Edward's army was each day, and we can chart his progress. And once he turned north from Poissy and crossed the Seine, we know that his army increased its daily rate of travel by 30%. So it's pretty clear they were booking it for Flanders, trying to get to the English allies up in the north above Normandy. Despite all of the precautions that Philippe took, Edward was able to effect a crossing of the Somme at Blanchetaque. It's a tidal ford, so when the tide goes out, there's a low spot in the Somme that it was considered miraculous at the time, because supposedly the ford was normally only wide enough for 2 men to ride across, and when Edward crossed, it was like wide enough for 30 or something like that. And I'm sure that's just part of the mythology. He did have to engage some troops there, but was able to cross the Somme at Blanchetaque and move forward. The next day, near the village of Crecy, the English met the French in direct battle, and the outcome was an utter disaster for the French. They outnumbered the English by about 2-1, but over the course of 2 days of fighting, they were destroyed. And we're going to talk about how the battle itself was conducted and some of the stories that come out of it. So there's a lot to debate about the conduct of the battle, but there are some commonalities. And if you want to do all of the homework for this, I highly recommend a book. And I've got notes with all of my sources on the last slide of this, but a book by Livingston and DeVries called The Battle of Crecy, a case book, which consists of about 100 primary source documents in parallel text. One side is in the original language, the other is in English translation, with minimal notes, and they're in chronological order, and they all date to within the first 54 years of Crecy. So they're all 14th century documents, which is really interesting when you see, okay, the Italians said this, but they were, and they were saying this within the year. The Flemish are saying this, but that was 20 years later. So anyway, so we look at how things line up. So generally, it's agreed the English drew themselves up for battle in a defensible position, fighting on foot, and had prepared the field in advance. They had gotten there first, and they had made their preparations. The French had been traveling to intercept the march, so they were in march formation. They encountered the English already arrayed for battle. It was late in the day. Edward had already split them once, so Philippe II, after some controversy among the other leading nobles, ordered the attack, even though it was already mid-afternoon. So because the French were not all drawn up and organized for battle, they came up on the English in successive waves. So the English are in this defensive and, according to some accounts, we'll see, fortified position. The first step was to try and disrupt them, which is just common, simple military strategy. If you've got an enemy who is well emplaced and entrenched, you're going to try and get him to break, try and make him lose cohesion. So the mercenary Genoese crossbowmen were sent forward to provide a screen for his cavalry. Unfortunately, because of the travel, the Genoese pavises, their big shields, were back in the baggage train at the rear. So the Genoese went forward effectively unprotected, lightly armored, and when they got within bowshot of the English, they got a shot off, and then the English opened up on them, rapid fire, and tore them up. The Genoese broke. And I want to note, these Genoese get a bad rap. These were seasoned mercenaries. These were pirates. These were the guys who had been stopping English shipping in the English Channel for the last couple of years. Now they're on land. These were pros, but they broke, and they broke directly into the path of the oncoming French cavalry. This served to disrupt the charge. The oncoming cavalry believed they were being betrayed. Many of the Genoese were actually slaughtered by the French, either run down or simply killed. And now the French knights, or the men-at-arms, are riding into the English longbow shot, and they're getting chewed up. They've never faced this weapon before. Well, some may have. The longbow was used in a naval engagement at Schleiss in 1340. But this would have been the first time a massed French army was seeing the longbow in use. And even if the men-at-arms armor was proof against it, their horses were getting cut down from under them. It was getting disrupted. We know the English had ditches dug. So a killing ground is now appearing in front of the English formation. Up to this point in the Chronicles, the English men-at-arms really aren't doing anything. They're letting the archers do the brunt of the killing. However, as the French move up, the English vanguard, which is under the command of Edward of Woodstock, the Prince of Wales, or the Black Prince, a title he never used during his lifetime. It was a tribute to him later. The Prince of Wales advanced into the fray, engaging the French. In fact, multiple contemporary accounts show that he advanced too far, too fast, and was captured. There's even a story of his standard bearer standing on the flagstaff to keep it from being captured. And the prince was rescued by the Bishop of Durham. And his father was none too pleased about this at the time. They later spun it into a great propaganda victory that the young prince earned his spurs at Crecy and all of that. One of the accounts says that the reason why he wasn't captured and ransomed is that the French nobles in the vanguard immediately set to arguing and fighting among themselves over who would get the ransom, which is very much in keeping with that individual glory, everyone wants to be a hero mindset we see crop up amongst the French many, many times in this period. At this point, the battle is irrevocably joined. Oftentimes when you're dealing with pre-modern warfare, there's a point where you have the point of contact and everything comes together, and now it's just moving on inertia. And things grind on until one side breaks. And in this case, there are so many French, and because they're coming in waves and the command and control is breaking down to an extent, it took a very long time to break. The battle raged on into the dusk. At some point around sundown, Philippe VI withdrew from the field. French accounts say he was wounded. Other accounts say he left because his advisors told him to. Right around that same time, the King of Bohemia, John, the notable blind King of Bohemia, entered the fray. And though blind, he chained his horses to his retinue and rode in and got himself killed. And finally, night fell and the fighting stopped. So they literally fought from the middle of the afternoon until dark. And what a lot of people don't realize is the battle picked up and continued the next day. When the fighting stopped, people just pretty much stopped in place. There's no sense of breaking to separate camps. Men just stopped where they were. And French and English. There are also accounts that are just horrifying. There's a poem written in the aftermath of Crecy, and one of the stanzas talks about a man at arms who was dragged out of the piles of dead 3 days after the battle, himself badly wounded. And I can only imagine the hell that would have been to survive. So there were 2 additional large conflicts on the field on the following day. They had the same outcome. And in the end, it was utter devastation for the French. After the battle, the English remained camped for another day. They erected a large pavilion where the arms of the dead were gathered, and the French heralds came to try and identify and count them. Philippe retreated to Amiens and tried to rally his forces there, but nothing doing. And then the English withdrew from the field and continued towards Flanders, reaching Calais on September 4th, which they immediately put to siege and would take almost a year to take. So, was Crecy a decisive battle? Well, I'm not sure that from a strategic standpoint it was decisive. It gave Edward a free run to Flanders, which he needed. It gave him room to take Calais, which became an important economic victory in the long run, because that would become the English base on the continent for the next couple of centuries. It certainly devastated the French nobility. Reading that memorial poem I mentioned, it's clear this was the French 9/11 in every real sense. The French lost, or the devastation was massive. A king died there. A duke died there. Multiple counts died there. An archbishop died there. A bishop died there. Many others in the aftermath of the battle were initially reported dead and then ended up having survived. The King of Majorca is one of those. In a letter from Edward III home, he mentions the King of Majorca was killed, and it turned out he was not. The emperor-elect of the Holy Roman Empire, who was the son of blind King John, just barely escaped. So I don't know if it was decisive, but it was devastating. There's no question about that. But largely, Edward was unable to press his advantage after taking Calais, because by that point, the Black Death was raging across Europe, and that changed the priorities. The myth of the story of the English two-finger salute. This is one we get. For those who don't know, a back of the hand peace sign is in England an obscene gesture. And there's an urban legend that it originated at Crecy because the French swore they were going to cut the fingers off of the English archers, and the English archers, gave this sign to basically tell the French off. And there's even a more elaborate version where they did this sign to say that they could still, quote, pluck you, Y-E-U, like a longbow. And to me, this just smacks of a Victorian gentleman's club over cigars and cognac, clever, naughty story. I don't believe it's actually true at all. But it is a big part of the popular culture. It shows up in a graphic novel by Warren Ellis called Crecy, which has some good stuff and some lovely art, but also a lot of myths. Where was the battle fought, and how does that affect our interpretations, and what preparations did Edward make for the battle? These are kind of tied together. So I want to talk about that. The location. First off, it's not entirely clear where Crecy was actually fought. The traditional site of the battlefield is based on a map that was published over 300 years after the battle. And since that time, it's largely been accepted as the location. There are some problems with it. Notably, if you visit the battlefield, there is a ridge in it that the French would have had to traverse in a very odd zigzag manner. And this is mentioned nowhere. And it would have caused a whole lot of tactical disruptions if their march was coming from the way it's traditionally interpreted. This is the classic case of people looking at an overhead map of the battlefield and not necessarily seeing the topography. Michael Livingston in the Battle of Crecy, a casebook, Dr. Livingston is a former Marine, and battlefield analysis is actually his thing. The other problems, there are no archaeological findings on the traditional site that indicate a battle would have taken place there. And also, if you look at the rates of travel from that kitchen account, the English army couldn't have gotten there. And all the English army account says is that they camped near the forest, or they camped in the forest near Crecy. And the thing is that around the town of Crecy, there's the town, there's also the forest of Crecy, and there is also the Mont de Crecy, which is a hill. So Crecy could have referred to any of those things in the kitchen account. So Livingston proposes an alternate site about 5 kilometers south of the traditional location. The topography of the site better aligns with the chronicle accounts that are written close to the battle. And there are also place names in that area that certainly seem connected. For instance, there is a high ground, and right in front of the high ground is a bit of a valley that you don't see when you're approaching the high ground. The ground dips, and that valley is actually called Le Jardin de Genoese, the Garden of the Genoese, which I can't help but think might be connected to a battle. Oftentimes, place names will give us indications that that other history won't. And if we use this topography, some of the preparations that are attributed to Edward make more sense. But first off, let's look at the traditional interpretation of the battle. It has Edward's army drawn up between Crecy and Waudecourt, 2 towns, and you can see that this particular interpretation is trying to deploy the archers in kind of a spiky, toothy formation. Okay, and I mean, that can work. It's not bad. This one doesn't particularly impede the men at arms, but if they move out from it, the archers are going to have a problem still shooting. But I guess the archers could pull back at that point. We see the wagon park back here, and this is oftentimes noted. Edward did have a substantial baggage train. You've got to remember he had been looting and pillaging for weeks by this point. So his wagon park is back here. That's a fairly standard medieval notion, and the French are coming up on the march, so they come up and they attack in piecemeal. So that is the traditional interpretation. If we take Livingston and de Vries' how that happened. Am I unmuted now?
Okay. Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I don't know how much was lost. Looking at this new interpretation, we see that the English drawn up, and instead of the wagon park being in the back, the Italians note this, that Edward built what is referred to as a wagenburg, or Wagenburg, where you take your wagons and you chain them together and you make a fortress. There are multiple Italian chronicles, and believe it or not, the Italians had a big stake in this because they were bankrolling Edward's campaign. So the bankers had records. So by this interpretation, the English built this wagenburg, put their men at arms inside it, dug a ditch, put their archers out here on the wings, put the vanguard here, and this way the vanguard could be reinforced, and the French came up. And this is the Livingston de Vries interpretation. I like it because it incorporates the Wagenburg. You'll see that the forest of Crecy is still here. The kitchen mentioned camping at a forest near Crecy, so it makes sense. Anyway, let's move on and talk about Poitiers, the other one, as Bia refers to it. That's how this class got its name when I was first talking about it. She said, oh, you're going to talk about Crecy, Agincourt, and the other one. Poitiers, despite its significant outcome, is probably the least storied of the battle. We're going to talk about how the events that led up to it, its conduct, and consider why it lacks some of that mythic character. I'm going to try and get through this because we're already at 45 minutes and I've got 2 hours. So, as I said, despite the victory at Crecy and the capture of Calais, the English weren't really able to capitalize on this, largely because of the Black Death. It hampered significant large-scale operations for about a decade. During this time, Jean II became King of France. He was trying to stabilize the kingdom, and he also tried to enact military reforms. In this case, they were largely done in the form of viewing the loss at Crecy as God's will and a moral failure. So notably, he created the Order of the Star as a parallel of England's Order of the Garter to try and instill greater chivalric spirit in his knights. He had probably the most renowned knight of the day, Geoffrey de Charny, write a book on chivalry to help educate the Knights of the Star. And while Charny's book has a lot of great practical advice in it, it's still very much written from the notion of individual glory and individual achievement. In 1355, the English were ready to go again. They launched a three-pronged chevauchée in France. The north one was led from Calais by Edward III. Another in Normandy was led by his brother Henry of Lancaster. And the third, which started in the Aquitaine, led by Prince Edward, was the only one that was successful, and boy, was it. There we go. Oops, sorry. I have backed too far. Having a little mouse trouble. Okay, in 1355, Edward sailed to Bordeaux in Guyenne, or Aquitaine. It's about 1,400 men at arms, 1,000 archers, 170 Welsh spearmen, so some light infantry. And he was joined by the local lords, so it's hard to tell how big his army was, possibly up to 4,000 or 5,000. In October 1355, he began a massive chevauchée, and he literally covered the entire breadth of France. He went from Bordeaux to Narbonne on the Mediterranean, then turned around and came back, burning all the way, about a 30-mile swath. In his letters to his father, he talks about the amount of economic damage they're doing and how the French won't come out to meet him. They burned the outer suburbs of Carcassonne. Toulouse, where the primary French lord in the area was only spared because they didn't have siege gear, and a siege is anathema to a chevauchée. It slows you down. So Toulouse didn't get the Carcassonne treatment, but it was a massive success. And on the next year, they decided to try it again. Lancaster left from Brittany and had some initial victories, which drew the French out. Jean II assembled an army, went to try and take on Lancaster, but Lancaster withdrew back to safer territory before the French could catch up. A few days later, Lancaster began a second march towards the Somme with the intention of linking up with Prince Edward, who had begun marching north and east from Bergerac in Guyenne. And he actually did a two-pronged march, again, burning all the way. This was another successful chevauchée, tearing up the north and east of France, obviously heading towards Paris, trying to get the French to engage. And he ran into very little opposition until he got to Tours, which he wanted to use to cross the Loire. And he could not take Tours, so then he tried to burn Tours, and it was heavily raining, so he wasn't able to do that. He knew that Jean had assembled north of Tours and that the Count of Poitiers was north of Tours. So at this point, Edward decided to turn back and head toward Bordeaux with the French in pursuit. The French king dismissed the majority of his infantry, but he still had 11,000 men at arms, and so not a small army by any means. Edward still expected to meet up with Lancaster, but Lancaster had been held up by flooding and couldn't get across the Somme. So as a result, they never linked up. The Prince of Wales turns south, the French pursue, and as oftentimes happens in medieval warfare, the French actually outmarch the English and get ahead of the English line of march without either side detecting the other. We find in chronicles oftentimes armies missing each other by the merest margin, by a mile or so, because there's a wood in the way or there's hills or whatever. It's easy to lose sight when we look at these battles of how rare a pitched battle was and how much had to go into one taking place. You basically had to have both sides drawn up and willing to fight and no alternative for it to happen. So in this case, the French had ended up ahead of the English near the town of Poitiers. The English came upon the French army already camped in battle array in their path. And they didn't have a lot of choice. They had to at least draw up for battle and then see how things played out. So unlike Crecy, we've got a really strong notion of where Poitiers took place. The chronicles note the topography with a lot of exactitude, and we can match that up on the map. So it's pretty easy to interpret the battle in that context. And it's important, and this is really important because Poitiers is different from Crecy, and we'll see different from Agincourt, in that it's very much a battle where tactics and combined arms played out over multiple phases of battle. And the terrain plays a very definite role. And we'll look at that when we start deploying the troops. But we can see the French were camped here. Poitiers is up to the north. And the English came marching out of the south, came out of the March of Noailles, where there was basically a causeway on the road. And they see the French and they have to draw up. Prior to the battle, there was, as often happened, an attempt to broker peace. The Cardinal of Perigord, who was, let's just say, not an honest broker in the eyes of the English, tried to negotiate a peace. It didn't work. It's likely the English were looking for an excuse to withdraw, but they were prepared to fight. And Edward basically said, you can't negotiate with me. You have to negotiate with my dad, and he's not here. So Edward drew his army up along this road they were on. It overlooked a small valley, and it was guarded in the east by a wood. So they've got something at their back here. And in the front, there was a hedge. And by hedge, I'm not talking about a decorative shrubbery. I'm talking about your classic French hedge, like you see tanks going through in World War II with special cutters. So big, thick thorn bushes, maybe 10 feet tall in places, 6 feet deep, occasional gaps in them, a very nice natural barrier to set up behind. And if your tactics are based on defense, you really couldn't have asked for a much more defensible position. They have their archers deployed on the flanks. Their army is in 3 battles, a right, center, and left. They have a small reserve of cavalry here. So here we see the English actually keeping cavalry. The cavalry are under the command of a Gascon knight named the Captal de Buch, who was a very notable figure, noted for his chivalry and his valor. The English came forth and deployed in 3 battles. The French had learned from Crecy, and I want to point this out because a lot of this class started in a conversation with a friend of mine who said, why didn't the French ever learn anything? Well, they did. The French had learned you don't charge the entrenched English on horse, at least not en masse. So they were formed into 3 battles. The vanguard was commanded ostensibly by the Dauphin, the son of the King of France. The second battle was under the control of the Duc d'Orléans. And the third one was commanded by Jean II, the king. They also had some cavalry, about 500 in two wings, who were heavily armored. It's mentioned that they were their horses were armored, supported by some men-at-arms and some crossbow. They were intended to disrupt the English archers on the flanks. So the first part of the battle, the English baggage train moved to the south back through the march and was covered by Warwick's left. Warwick's side slid back to the back down the road. Whether this was an intentional move or whether it was a precursor to the English trying to withdraw, we don't know, but the effect of it was that the French cavalry immediately charged. They saw English movement, they went for it. When the French charged, Warwick's forces turned in place to fight from the cover of the hedge. The archers didn't have a lot of luck initially until the French got in close, and then they were able to use the marsh and reposition themselves to shoot on the flank, at which point they started tearing things up. The other French cavalry had to come uphill, which is never great for cavalry. The men-at-arms were coming up from behind, and they took severe casualties. At that point, the Anglo-Gascon right moved into the hedge and began engaging. And both the French cavalry commanders were killed and the survivors broke towards the French camp. The Dauphin advanced and engaged the English right at the hedge. They began their advance before they knew what was going to happen with the cavalry. The French, under the Dauphin, forced their way through the hedge, particularly on the north end of it where it was lighter, and they engaged the Anglo-Gascon troops for about 2 hours, which is a very, very long time to be fighting, even if you've got lots of guys. Edward reinforced the right with troops from the center. Most of the fighting was still on that right flank at this point. After about 2 hours, and having failed to make headway, the Dauphin was ordered to withdraw from the field. This almost certainly came from his father. Orleans, in the second division, initially moved forward, then withdrew as well. He may have been doing that to protect the Dauphin on the king's orders. He may have misinterpreted his orders. We don't know. In the event of losses like this, there are always recriminations, so it's hard to tell from the chronicles. But we know that all of a sudden, the only major unit left for the French was the battle commanded by Jean II. It had the sacred French banner, the Oriflamme. It had a lot of quality troops. It was big. Their numbers were still suitable, and the French advanced. This is where the battle takes on much more of a tactical element, where it gets interesting, at least for me. By this point, the English archers are largely out of arrows, so the French advance is coming up without a lot of impediment. They moved to a more center position and were penetrating the English positions. They were fighting effectively, and it's important to note that. The French were good. This battle, by the way, would have probably been primarily with spears and poleaxes, hammers, that sort of thing, rather than fighting with swords, but you're using whatever you have. At this point, the English cavalry reserve began a broad outflanking maneuver. There's a hill right about here, and the Captal de Buch led his cavalry out and around and then back to hit the French left. At that same time, Edward ordered all of his knights who weren't in action to remount and prepare. And when the Captal de Buch hit the French left, the English cavalry pushed through the hedge and hit the French right. And at that point, the battle is really over, except for the mopping up. The French broke into smaller groups. They were defeated. They were surrounded and defeated. The Oriflamme fell, and Jean, the king, and Prince Philippe were both captured. In the immediate aftermath, the English pursued and killed many of the fleeing French. A lot were actually killed outside the town of Poitiers because the townspeople closed the gates and locked them out. About 1,000 Frenchmen were noted as worthy of ransom and taken captive. Overall, the French casualties amounted to about 3,000 out of 11,000 troops, while the English lost about 400. The battle was far closer in many respects than Crecy. I find it interesting because it was a victory of combined arms and all of the pieces were there. The big measure of Crecy is the fact that the King of France was now a captive. He went back to England. This eventually led to the bankruptcy of France trying to ransom him, and the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360, which brought about a peace, or a relative peace. So why is Poitiers the other one? We don't know as much about it. Yes, there are some stories about Poitiers. There's fiction. Conan Doyle's Sir Nigel has Poitiers as a big part of the battle or of the story, and it's a good yarn. If you've never read it, it may be sort of post-Victorian, but it's fun. But why doesn't this have the same myths? I think some of it is because we've got a pretty good idea of what happened. There's less room for myth making. Also, I think to some, the capture of the French king in a heroic last stand doesn't carry the same weight as his father fleeing the battlefield. Also, it changes the focus to knightly conduct, knights capturing knights for ransom instead of the common man defeating the noble. And because it was a combined arms effort, it takes away from some of that working class versus everyman narrative that we get with a lot of Anglo-centric anti-aristocratic mythology. One of the reasons why I think Agincourt resonates is because it's got a certain victory of the common man notion, and even in the in Shakespeare, Henry has a common touch, and it appeals to that patriotic notion. Also, the similarities between Crecy and Agincourt allow them to be lumped into similar narratives. It's easy to think about those battles because in many ways they played out similarly. Poitiers was more complicated, and it's a different type of victory, and it required me a whole lot of read-throughs and a whole lot of making copies of my own maps to really understand the way it played out. And the big reason why Agincourt, or why Poitiers is the other one is because of Shakespeare. Thanks to Bill and 2 excellent film adaptations in the 20th century, it's the best known of the 3 battles. However, much of what we know about it is propaganda. It's a good story. It's fun. It's lovely. I love both of these movies to death. I particularly love the Olivier warts and all because it's so colorful. But this victory is so grounded in the English psyche. There's a lot of myths that persist to this day, to the point that honestly, sometimes addressing them is viewed as anti-English. But we've had some really excellent work by historians in the last 20 years or so that give us, if not clear pictures, certainly some new pictures that are worth looking at about Agincourt. So before we talk about it, we need to talk about some of the things that were going on between Poitiers and Agincourt. Going back to that question of how could the French have forgotten? Well, for one thing, between Poitiers and Agincourt were 60 years, 3 generations. The losses stung and were certainly storied in the memory, but the actual tactical lessons, to an extent, they had blurred. Some of the reason why they had blurred is that the French had adapted. The French had accomplished some things in those 6 decades of time. So Jean II died in English captivity 4 years after the Treaty of Bretigny brought to an end what we call the Edwardian stage of the 100 Years' War. And his successor, Charles V, was pretty good. He did a good job to rebuild the treasury. He got rid of the companies of routiers, basically armed brigands that were left unemployed after the Treaty of Bretigny. And in the 20 years or so of his reign, or 16 years of his reign, he basically got all of the territory ceded back to the English by Bretigny. Bretigny, the French said, okay, we're not going to claim the French crown, give us back all of Aquitaine and we'll stop fighting. And that's the high points of it. But by 1380, he'd reclaimed almost all of those territories through military victories. In the meantime, in England in 1376, Prince Edward, the Prince of Wales, died. His father, Edward III, died the following year, leaving the throne in the hands of Richard II, a 10-year-old boy. This meant a regency. This meant all sorts of regency councils, squabbles, and the English focus turned within. So the English weren't focused on France. France itself didn't have to deal with England, so France could focus on France and rebuild. Richard II was very much not a military king. He sought to bring an end to the conflict. He was also very much not his father or grandfather. He was subject to favorites. He was ruled by them. He lost control of government for 2 years in the late 1380s. Ultimately, in 1399, he was deposed by his uncle, Henry Bolingbroke, who was crowned King Henry IV. So we have this period of internal turmoil where the English aren't particularly concerned with the continent, relatively speaking. In France, when Charles V died, he was succeeded by his 11-year-old son. So we've got another situation of a youth on the throne and regency. During his minority, France was ruled by his uncles, who all had their own agendas, squabbled amongst themselves. They were often in conflict either with the crown or each other. When Charles VI ended his regency, for the next 4 years, he was pretty capable and competent, and things got better. But in 1392, Charles suffered the first of multiple bouts of mental illness. It's hard to diagnose from a 600-year remove, but it appears to be some form of violent schizophrenia. His very first bout resulted in multiple people being killed by him, and it wasn't constant. He had periods where he was lucid and capable and competent, and periods where he was utterly mad and thought he was made of glass and that he would break if anyone touched him. And France really did not have a tradition, method, or means of deposing a king. So this meant regents. It meant a struggle for power again. Henry IV very much wanted to rekindle the conflict in France. Henry IV was a great warrior. He was a great tournament fighter. He was a crusader. But because he had taken the crown by force, effectively, he had to spend a lot of his time defending himself. There were many rebellions, the Welsh as well as the Percy's rebellions, assassination attempts. His son, Henry of Monmouth, the Prince of Wales, future Henry V, spent his adolescence and young adulthood becoming a warrior fighting in his father's civil wars. In France in 1407, Louis d'Orléans, the Duke of Orleans, was assassinated, and by the Duke of Burgundy, or at the behest of the Duke of Burgundy, who made no apologies for it, made no attempt to hide it. In fact, had a bishop justify it. And this resulted in what is referred to as the Armagnac-Burgundian War. It was a civil war amongst the French royal family. And at times it was an out-and-out pitched battle conflict. It would last until 1435. So it outlasts well beyond Charles VI's reign, beyond the scope of this class. But the fact that this civil war was going on and was 8 years old at the time of the Agincourt campaign had an impact on the French reactions to the English and to the politics of it. In 1413, Henry IV died, and at his coronation, Henry V asserted his claim to the French throne, something the English had not done since the Treaty of Bretigny. From 1414 to 1415, negotiations, lots of negotiations. Henry is claiming the French crown, but it's clear his primary interest is getting control of Western France, essentially from Calais all the way down the west coast to Gascony, obtaining the outstanding debt from John II's ransom, because the French still owe quite a bit, and securing a marriage to the king's youngest daughter, Catherine de Valois. And interesting, this marriage was even being proposed before he was king. And it continues being a piece of the negotiations that the French are even offering during this time. So clearly it was something that was always on the table. I find that interesting. During this period, the English were supplying military aids to both sides of the Burgundian-Armagnac conflict. They're not necessarily simultaneously, and it had little effect. A lot of times the English would send an army like they were supposed to, and then one side would say, well, we don't need you, and the English would say, fine, pay us and we'll go back. By and large, though, the English viewed the Burgundians as potential allies due to various marriage alliances, and the Burgundians definitely used this for their internal politics. There was a lot of notions of, well, we'll just side with the English and then see what you do. And when we get to the point where the French are raising their army to oppose Henry on the Agincourt campaign, the Duke of Burgundy is specifically told, you can send your retainers, you can send your soldiers, but you aren't coming. Stay home, which did not sit well and definitely had political repercussions. In early 1415, the negotiations broke down. The English claimed the French had mocked Henry. This might be the source of Shakespeare's tennis balls, but there's no evidence the Dauphin ever sent Henry tennis balls. The Dauphin doesn't get any good love from Shakespeare. The Dauphin, to be honest, was not a particularly military figure. So, he's an easy target. But he honestly doesn't play a role in this story historically, which is kind of, one of those things where the myths and the history don't meet up. So Henry raised his army similarly to Edward III in dentures, with men-at-arms and nobles who raised their own companies by contract. True story, we get the word indenture because the written contract was then cut on a zigzag, what in heraldic terms is called an indenture, and each side got one side of it, and that way you matched them up and you had the full document. The indentures still specified the composition of the companies, but now the ratio of archers to men-at-arms was 5-1. So his invasion force probably amounted to about 12,000 soldiers. Only about 2,000 were men-at-arms. We don't have a plan of the campaign, but we can see from what he did that he was paralleling Edward III. Invade Normandy, take a town, march toward Calais, and try and cross the Somme at Blanchetoc. That's going to show up here. He sailed in August, landed at Harfleur on August 13th, and began the siege 5 days later. He invested the town, he surrounded it, and besieged and began the siege. He used cannon in the siege, but there was no once more into the breach speech. Sorry, sorry, Shakespeare. We do know there were cannon. He'd imported them and gunners from the Empire and from Flanders. They planned an assault for September 18th. The town negotiated and said, if we aren't relieved by the 23rd, we'll surrender. So they never actually assaulted Harfleur, and they surrendered on the 22nd when no relief was coming. The English casualties were light, but dysentery ran rampant through the army. Over 1,300 men were invalided home to England. A lesser number died because they started sending the sick home, but we have records of all of this, and it's actually kind of handy to be able to judge the size of Henry's army, because we do know he started with X number of guys and had to send X number home sick. On October 8th, Henry left a garrison of about 1,200 at Harfleur and began a march for Calais. Unlike Edward's march in Crecy, this was not a chevauchée, it was just a march to Calais. That was clearly the plan, making a statement, seizing Harfleur, and marching north. We know this because they focused on movement, not destruction, And we also know this because their records indicate they left Harfleur with only 8 days worth of supplies. They planned on marching up the coast and getting there in about a week. They didn't raid, so speed and time were clearly of the essence. Meanwhile, the French, when he had besieged Harfleur, the French had begun gathering an army at Rouen, getting them together. And Rouen was the historic capital of Normandy, about halfway between Paris and Harfleur. They didn't get the army gathered in time. Remember, we're dealing with a whole lot of politics here. So the town surrendered. And when Henry marched out, about a week later, the bulk of the army marched toward Amiens. The bridges over the Somme were destroyed or garrisoned to prevent an English crossing, just like in the Crecy campaign. And a smaller advance guard was dispatched to Abbeville to hold the north side of the Somme from any sorts of attacks or any sort of crossings. So Henry's initial plan was to go to Blanchetaque, just like his grandfather had. However, the French had again learned the lesson. The French did know their history. They knew things they did learn. So Blanchetaque was occupied by about 6,000 men under command of Boucicaut, who was the Marshal of France and probably the most prominent French knight of the age. You can read about him in all sorts of chronicles of his victories and tournaments and the deeds of arms he undertook. According to the French accounts, the English were alerted to this by a Gascon prisoner, and Henry turned his army east to find another crossing. Well, he's marching along the Somme trying to find a crossing, and the bridges are destroyed, and he's also got an army of 6,000 who are now shadowing him on the other side, and he can see them. These two armies are basically marching with a river between them. So it's turning into a race for time. This diversion really cost Henry dearly, because by the time they're finally able to find a crossing at Peronne, they are now on day 13 of their 8-day march. They were on, or day 12, they were on day 5 when they got to Blanchetaque. So now they're on day 12 out of 8 days. And the only reason that they really got across there is there's a little bend at a point in the Somme that the French had to go around and the English could straight shoot because they were south of it. So by this point, it's pretty clear to everyone that a battle is going to happen. The French army is growing daily. Henry actually arrayed his army south of Bapaume to try and draw the French into battle, but the French withdrew. I think they had word they were expecting even more troops. The French heralds then offered battle at Aubigny, which was west of Arras near Saint-Paul. And given the movements of the armies, it's likely that the French expected this fight and that Henry gave them the slip and went west instead, trying to get toward Calais. The French moved to intercept, and the two armies came together on October 24th near the town of Maisonceau. So let's talk about the French and what they know and what they've learned and what they're doing. So we know that prior to the battle, the French Marshal and Constable, Boucicaut and Albrecht, developed and wrote a plan of action. We have a copy of it. The lone surviving copy of the document was discovered in the British Library in 1981. And while it's damaged, it was still legible, and we can read much of what it intended. And it shows that the French knew what the English were going to do. They knew how the English fought. It proposed for the majority of the French army to form up on foot with 2 wings of cavalry intended to attack and disrupt the English archers. Once that assault was underway, the main battle of the French army would then move forward in full armor and shields and destroy the numerically inferior English center. This was the plan. Here's the problem. It required significant command and control to execute, which became something the army lacked when the Duke of Alençon, who was the senior noble, in the French army asserted control over the Marshal and Constable of France, who really should have been in charge. The Duke of Alençon, decent guy, not the military commander that either Boucicaut or Albret were. Also, complicating matters, the English already knew the plan. They had captured French men-at-arms along the way and had interrogated them and knew what the plan was. They had actually made adaptations. And finally, we're going to see that French hubris did play a part in the battle. Despite a significant numerical advantage in men-at-arms, we'll talk about that in a bit, a combination of overconfidence and a desire for individual glory undermined the plan. And this is French culture and French martial culture. That notion of being the individual hero instead of being part of a cohesive unit. The night prior to the battle, when it became clear that it was too late in the day to actually fight, the French camped on a field near the edge of a wood near where the battle would take place. The notion that the French spent the night before celebrating their victory appears to be Shakespeare's invention. The night was actually cold and wet, hardly the venue for a feast. Also, the Dauphin the Dolphin was not there. He wasn't at Agincourt at all. Neither was the King of France, of course. The English, when they realized battle wasn't going to be joined, they withdrew slightly and camped around the town of Maisoncelles. Henry stayed in a house at Maisoncelles. They knew the French plan. All the archers had been instructed to equip themselves with a long stake that could be planted in the ground, sharpened on both ends so it could be hammered in. Believe it or not, this is a new tactical innovation. This is the first time it is used on the continent in warfare, this notion of a mobile stake. It had been used previously by the Ottomans at the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396, which Boucicaut was a participant in. He wrote about it in a book of his exploits, and it's likely that Henry had actually read this book because he had a copy of it in his library. So this wouldn't have been the first time Boucicaut had seen this tactic, but it was the first time it was done in European warfare. The English were ordered to keep silent throughout the night. The motivation for this is unknown, but it is noted, particularly in the French chronicles, that it unnerved the French. They suspected the English might be slipping away in the dark. You know, the French wanted battle. They wanted to crush the English. Henry was riding around wearing a crown with fleur-de-lis on it and a surcoat quartered with England and France. They wanted to beat him. It's important to note, this wasn't just a matter of, oh, the English are here, let's drive them out. They wanted to beat this little upstart into the ground. So they wanted battle. In the middle of the night, the English sent out scouts to inspect the field and found that it was sodden and muddy, and we're talking deep European black mud, the sort that you get in the north of France. Lovely, rich soil, great for crops, lousy for warfare. There's no indication, though, that Henry went forth incognito among the men, as Shakespeare does. It makes a nice story, but again, we have no indication of this. What we know is that he spent the night in a house in Maisoncelles and rose early like he did every day. On the morning of the battle, the French drew up, depending on the accounts, either into 3 battles or 2. I'm persuaded that they were in 2 battles. The forward one was composed of the nobles, the magnates, the royal officers, basically all of the people who said, I'm important enough to be up here in the front. The rear guard was composed of lesser men-at-arms, valets, armed servants, latecomers to the battle. There were a token force of archers and crossbowmen, but not many. They're not showing up on this particular diagram because they literally do not figure into the narratives of the battle. The 2 wings of cavalry were set up initially behind so that they could come around the flanks. However, the numbers were not what they expected. They wanted 500 or 600 for each cavalry wing. Instead, They got 360 in one and 120 in the other, so about 45% of the cavalry they anticipated. Henry had been up before dawn, attended masses. He attended 3 masses a morning every day of his life. He was deeply religious. And then arrayed his men at arms in a single battle, according to the chronicles, only 4 ranks deep. So a very thin line, with his archers deployed on the wings with their stakes. There's no evidence that Henry made anything like the St. Crispin's Day speech. We know he did exhort his troops, reminding them of the rightness of his cause and that God would protect them, because a victory during this period was viewed as God's will. Before hostilities were joined, there was one more attempt to broker a peace, but it was clear from the French envoys they weren't serious. One of their negotiators was a French knight who had been captured earlier and was on parole. And part of his parole was he was not going to take up arms against the English again. And there he was in full armor negotiating for the French. So the English didn't take him seriously. It was very clear that there was not going to be a settlement at that late stage. So the negotiations failed. The 2 armies faced each other across the field for 3 hours. The French again knew their history. They knew how dangerous the English were in a defensive formation. They were trying to outweight the English. The English were trying to outweight the French. The French were clearly primed for battle. They're described as being wound like springs. They are ready to go, but they are waiting and waiting and waiting. And finally, after 3 hours, Henry orders the archers on the far right wing to begin shooting. It's extreme range. It's really not having an effect, but he's trying to gall the French into action. And at the same time, he orders his army to pull up stakes and advance, not very far. We're talking probably 20, 30 paces at most, because if the archer's having to pull up stakes and then put them back, that's taking time. So it can't be a huge advance and still be able to hold your formation. But they start moving. And once they start moving, the English let go. The English vanguard, who have been raring for battle since sunup, are now ready to go. And they begin their advance in cloying mud about a half mile, and they surprise their own cavalry, who have to mount up and start their job. The vanguard begins making its way across the field in full armor, heavy mud, with visors down, marching into the sun. So for those of you who fight Shiv with a full visor, and if you fought with the sun in your face, this is not optimal. As they came within bowshot, the English opened up on them from the flanks. It's impossible to determine what the effects of this were. I suspect that the direct casualties probably weren't many, but they're being subjected to a battering that's affecting their vision. It's adding to the fatigue of their muddy watch. Getting hit all the time is tiring, and it doubtlessly impacted their morale. The cavalry attempted to disrupt the archers, but between the muddy field, the stakes, the flanking shot, and their small numbers, they were repulsed and broke towards the center of the field, right into the vanguard, which caused further disruption and casualties and chewed up the field. So things are already out of control, and this is a case where the French need for glory defeated any command and control structure that might have been in place. As the French vanguard advanced, they get funneled. They're taking hits from arrows on the left and the right, and even if they're not necessarily causing wounds or deaths directly, they're still causing the French to bunch up in the center, which makes them narrower, deeper, and more congested. When they finally reach the English men at arms, many of them lack the room to even fight. They can't even raise their arms to fight the English, and they're cut down. As the casualties mount at the front, it's Crecy all over again. The rear is pushing into them. The men-at-arms in the front are literally buried by the press from behind. As the attack founders, the archers are running out of arrows. They abandon their bows and start attacking the flanks on foot. So now the carnage is coming in on the sides. The French finally manage to get it together and pull back, and the English start digging prisoners out of the mud. A French cavalry remnant successfully raids the English baggage train and rides off. French rearguard then begins to advance. The English, have had a breather, but they also have a whole lot of prisoners now behind their lines. Henry's worried that if the French rearguard comes into contact, the prisoners are going to break their paroles and start attacking from behind. So he orders the prisoners executed. This was a highly controversial move even at the time. It was unpopular with the army. In some accounts, he had to order the archers to do it because they had less of a vested interest than the men-at-arms in taking the ransoms. In some cases, the stories say it was done with brutal efficiency, but there are French accounts of a man-at-arms who was wounded and in a battle or in a barn with other wounded that was set on fire. So we don't know, but we know that a lot of the French prisoners were killed at this point. Not all of them, though. The French rearguard breaks off before any serious conflict, and the battle is over. Unlike Poitiers, unlike Crecy, this one happened in a relatively short window of time. Once the battle was joined, the chroniclers on both sides note how quickly matters transpired, how fast it was over. It turned into a killing ground very quickly. The French couldn't back out of it, and bad things happened, and it was over. And like in Shakespeare's play, the French heralds came to Henry and told him the day was his, and even told him that castle in the background is called Agincourt. Which is nice. Not in the background of this particular illumination, but over there, figuratively in the story. All told, the English lost about 450 men, which is much more than what Shakespeare likes to report. The French conservatively lost around 4,000 plus somewhere between 700 and 1,500 prisoners. They probably lost more than 4,000, but it's hard to say because we've got controversy over the numbers that we're going to look at. The French, or the English, having won and being exhausted, remained in the vicinity for the day and then marched on to Calais, arriving 3 days later. So let's look at the questions and controversies about Agincourt. The first one is, was Agincourt a decisive victory? Again, in the mythology, in Henry V, Henry wins and then goes to Paris and signs a treaty with the French king, woos the princess, wins the day, all great and heroic. It really wasn't decisive, though, not at the time. It decimated the French nobility of Normandy, but it was a very localized regional loss. The rest of France, down to the south, the Loire, certainly the south of France, relatively unimpacted by the battle. Even French Flanders, not particularly impacted. You do see in Normandy entire male sides of families being wiped out, fathers, sons, that sort of thing. But in terms of the tactical impact, the Burgundians were still relatively intact. Neither the king or the Dauphin was present, though the Dauphin would die of disease in the next year. Henry spent the next 2 years reclaiming Normandy, and then didn't sign the Treaty of Tours and marry Catherine de Valois until 1420, 5 years later. Of course, 2 years after the marriage, Henry died, leaving an infant heir to the thrones of England and France, and a disinherited Dauphin fighting for his crown. And ultimately, the war would continue until 1453, when the French won. So not decisive, important, key, certainly led to the French reclaiming Normandy, but it also set up the slow grind outcome of the final stage of the war that the French would ultimately win. Um, were the French suffering from dysentery? This is a real common myth that we see, that the French were not only exhausted and starving, but they were suffering from disease. There's stories of the archers basically dropping their brays on the, on the field so that they could fight with dysentery and diarrhea. There's no real evidence of this. We know that the soldiers who were suffering from dysentery had been sent home from Harfleur in order to contain the illness. The medieval people didn't have a strong germ theory of disease, but they knew that being around sick people made other people sick. So as a result, they sent the sick folks home. So chances are dysentery was not playing a role at this point. Did French military culture determine the outcome? Oh, almost certainly. We know this because of the French battle plan not being followed properly, because of the military commanders being supplanted by their social betters, by the way the vanguard was organized. And one of the things that I find interesting in here, Juliet Barker notes this in her book on Agincourt, which I have problems with in some places, but this is one of the things that I do find interesting in the differences between England in the early 15th century and France in the early 15th century. The English army, and we have the indentures and things to look at, we see lots and lots of Johns, Williams, Roberts, Thomases, Henrys, Nicholases. In the French Roll of the Dead, we see a whole lot of Lancelots, Hectors, Yvains, Florida. We see a Gawain, we see a Percival, we see a Palomides, we see a Tristan, we see an Arthur. These are knights raised from birth in a culture that values that heroic, chivalric, individual glory, and they cannot break out of it, even to fight a decisive battle, because their first instinct in battle is it is the chance of individual glory. To quote Charney, he who does the most is worth the most. And doing work and being worth the most means fighting the hardest, taking the most prisoners, making the most glory for yourself. And that just doesn't lend itself to coherent military strategy. These last two, how large were the armies and where was the battle fought? Unsurprisingly, these are questions with some controversies attached. The numbers is probably the greatest controversy regarding Agincourt, because it was a monumental win for the English and a monumental loss for the French. Depending on whose chronicles you're reading, the numbers shift. The English accounts have them outnumbered 4-1. The French say we outnumbered them 5-4. Casualties are also adjusted depending on political need, from the handful of Shakespeare up to much higher numbers. And on the French, sometimes it's saying 60,000 dead. Well, the entire French army couldn't probably put 60,000 men in the field, and the entire French army wasn't there at the time. In 2005, Anne Curry published Agincourt, A New History. And her approach was to look at the indentures, to look at the records, to look at the enrollment rolls, to see who was listed as being there, who was being paid to be part of these armies. And her argument is the English army consisted of 9,000 to 10,000, with about 2,000 being men at arms. And she says the French army was only 12,000. Which would mean that they outnumbered the English, 4-3 or 6-5, but that the French army was almost entirely men at arms. And her take on the whole notion of Agincourt being this great, brilliant victory is because the English only had 2,000 men at arms. So in terms of men at arms, they were outnumbered 6-1. And there's a lot of room to criticize that, in my view, and the view of a lot of other scholars, a lot of other people I've read. They feel that particularly on the French side, her reliance on administrative records is shaky ground because of the way French armies were raised. And not only that, but a French man-at-arms in the field was typically accompanied by an armed valet. So that's another man-at-arms right there. So you can almost double the size, or at least increase it by another 50% doing that. So numbers that I'm happier with are somewhere, 6,000 to 8,000 English and 14 to 15,000 French. But I'm willing to look at other accounts. And we've got to be careful about things like eyewitness accounts. There are actually 4 eyewitness accounts to the battle, but only one was written immediately after, the Gesta Henricus, which was written in 1417. And it was written by a member of the clergy, so not a military man, who was in Henry's retinue at the battle. He was in the baggage train at the time of the raid, as a matter of fact, though he seems pretty calm about the baggage train being raided. It's just like, oh, and some French bandits stole some things. All right, good. Seems like it would have been a little scarier, but I'm not there. And the Gesta Henricus was written specifically for the purpose of defining the victory in terms of God's will and for an ecclesiastical audience. So I think we have to even take it with a grain of salt. The other eyewitness accounts were written anywhere from 25 to 40 years after the battle, and recollections can change, and that's both on the French side and the English side. So numbers, they get inflated, they get changed depending on the reports. Also, the location has its own controversies. Traditionally, the battle site is between the towns of Agincourt and Tramecourt. If you look at it on Google, if you want to go visit, you'll see a marker for where the battle site is. That's the battle. Much like the accepted location, there's no archaeological evidence for the battle having occurred on that site. An English officer in 1818 claimed to have found some artifacts from the time, but these have never been substantiated. The warehouse where they were stored was burned in the 19th century and they were lost. On 3 occasions so far this century, conflict archaeologist Tim Sutherland has conducted surveys of the traditional battle site. He has located over 100 artifacts, including Roman coins, potsherds from the medieval period, no medieval coins whatsoever, projectiles of all sorts, but they're all gunpowder ammunition dating to later times. Nothing dating to the medieval era indicating a battle. And because you can find Roman coins, you can't even say, well, the soil is hostile to archaeology. Facetiously, he concludes there's no physical evidence of the battle ever taking place. Well, we know the battle took place, so we need to look at where. And this is where Dr. Michael Livingston comes in again, the conflict archaeologist. He had visited the battle site, and in looking at it, he noticed something that a lot of historians might overlook, given his background. He noticed it's too small. There's not enough room. So this is where the Battle of Agincourt is traditionally supposed to be. And we have Tramecourt over here. We've got Agincourt over here. And on this map, that's not a lot of space, believe it or not. He noted that the battlefield is too small. Even if you take the most conservative estimates of English soldiers, and if you need them to fight effectively, so if you take that small number and proportion of archers and men-at-arms and line them up in 4 ranks, in order to fight effectively, a man-at-arms needs about 1.5 meters square around him, which, as a gamer, I humorously note is D&D's 5 foot square. So that army would have taken up a frontage of about 1.9 kilometers. The traditional battlefield site is only 880 meters across. So he ruled it out and he said, well, let's see what we can find near here. So he was looking at the Gesta Henricus, and while we need to take some of it with a grain of salt, it does a good job of noting when and where they were. And Henry's march notes that Henry doesn't advance to Agincourt. He stops at Maisoncelles with the French army in front of him, and the armies were camped within close proximity, about half a mile apart. If the French camped closer to Agincourt, as the traditional site would suppose, since they camped near the battle, the armies would have been more like 2 miles apart. And based on that, he proposed an alternate location about 2 kilometers south of the traditional location. So Maisoncelles is just to the south of here. And that makes sense, since many of the chronicles note that the English could not only see the French fires in the night, they could hear the French. And I don't think you can hear an army 2 miles away unless they are partying it up like rolling thunder. And since it was a dark, cold, rainy night, I don't see that. So as a result, I am persuaded that the battle was fought further to the south. There are some other pieces of evidence that are interesting to note. The earliest French map of the region, which was printed in 1704, puts the battle to the southwest of Agincourt, immediately north of Maisoncelles, directly in the path of the English march. Same feature shows up on a map by Cassini in 1750. Later French maps produced in the Napoleonic era don't note the location of the battle, but they recorded a lot of the local place names. And again, this can be important and valuable. Just outside of Maisoncelles is a place known as l'Anglais, the English. And there's a small valley north of there called Morival, Death Valley. And the highest ground between l'Anglais and Morival is still known as Le Côte de Saint-Georges, the Hills of St. George. Again, we can't prove this is a connection, but it's compelling and it fits the other things. And finally, Monstrelet's chronicle, which has a history of Agincourt in it, which was written in the 15th century and had some eyewitness accounts in it. They were older, of course. You can tell from the illuminations, this is much later. But it depicts the English fighting at the base of a hill with Agincourt on the right, on their right flank. And on the traditional battlefield, the castle of Agincourt is on their left flank. Again, this isn't conclusive, but it is compelling in its own way. The nice thing about this, at least for me, who had drawn a whole lot of maps for this presentation, is this new interpretation really doesn't change the revision of the flow of the battle. In either location, it took place in much the same way. There are differences in terms of minutiae, but in terms of the big picture, we're still very much on the same page. Okay. So wrapping up, while this was kind of a tongue-in-cheek title, and I'm not sure necessarily confronting the myths is really necessary in the SCA. We know a lot of these things. We've learned them by doing. We know Shakespeare is an actual history. I hope I've managed to shed a little bit of light on the way warfare was conducted that you might not have considered, how these narratives can change as new evidence comes to light. And failing that, I hope you learned at least one new fact. I have a big pile of sources. A link to this presentation is both on the Onstera documentation depot. I forget what it's actually called. I've also got a link in the chat here so you can download a copy. These are selected sources. I did hit a whole lot of other things along the way, but these are the ones that really inform this. I'm going to stop the share and take a look at questions real quick because I think I've got a few. So let me say, oh, just Orleans deserved it. Okay, do we have any questions? Since I do have a couple minutes.
At this time, I have unmuted you if you would like to ask some questions.
And if not, I thank you for your time and your attention. I know I'm supposed to wrap. Go ahead.
I do have a question. I've read a couple of fictional accounts talking about sort of the the last stand of de Charny at Poitiers.
Mhm.
Are there contemporary accounts? Is there
Nope.
anything anything pre-19th century that talks about that?
Not really. Froissart says the Oriflamme fell. But
Okay, probably have to
he
do
was-
something to de Charny to make that happen. But yeah,
yeah, they had to do something to him, and we know de Charny was notable. And yes, I have read some of those accounts as well, and they make for great fun. And I recommend reading them because, my gosh, particularly the one in the Ill-Made Night is just epic. But the French didn't really write about it. One of the things that we run into with a lot of these battles and a lot of the primary source accounts is that the French wanted to forget it. One of the reasons why we have trouble knowing where those two battles were fought is that the French didn't care. And they only began caring in the 19th century when the English aristocratic classes started doing the grand tour of Europe. And they wanted to see where Agincourt happened. And if you'll notice, Agincourt shows up on the maps near the town of Agincourt about the same time the grand tour is happening in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And that's when suddenly at Crecy you get, oh, this windmill is the one Edward stood on to view the battle.
Mm-hmm.
And it's conveniently close to the town of Crecy as opposed to being off in the woods, 2 miles south. Now, again, this is a little bit my interpretation on things, but I think it holds some water. That there's not a lot of vested interest in the losers sometimes on remembering exactly where things happened. So anyway, I do need to wrap up 10 minutes early, so I'm going to go ahead and honor that. Thank you so much for your time. Bia, you can go ahead and stop the recording.